They didn't just hide parts of Victorian London from you. They erased the most disgusting part of it. If you were homeless in 1880, your biggest threat wasn't crime, it was the food. History books often paint Victorian London as a pinnacle of industrial triumph and refined etiquette, but for those living on the streets, it was a visceral, high-stakes nightmare. If you were homeless in 1880, you weren't just fighting for your dignity, you were fighting a biological war against a city that treated your survival as a commercial opportunity. From the toxic banquets sold on street corners to the literal chemical warfare occurring in your breakfast bread, being poor in the greatest city on earth meant living in a state of constant structural decay. This wasn't just poverty, it was a calculated, industrial-scale assault on the human body. The bizarre banquet, the culinary lottery of the slums.
In Victorian London, 1 penny could buy you a feast that would make a modern stomach turn. But in a world where hunger was a permanent shadow, a bizarre banquet was the only thing keeping the city's heart beating. If you're imagining a quaint food festival with artisanal pies, stop right there. The street food of the 1800s wasn't about flavor. It was a desperate ritual of survival where the secret ingredient was often industrial fraud or biological decay. For the price of a single copper, you weren't just buying lunch, you were entering a culinary lottery where the grand prize was simply waking up the next morning without a fever. To understand the scale of this stomach-churning economy, you have to look at the street sellers who lined the fog-choked corners of East London. The most famous staple was the penny eel pie. On the surface, it sounds British and traditional.
In reality, the eels were pulled directly from the Thames, the same river that functioned as the city's primary sewer. These eels lived on a diet of human waste and industrial chemicals, making them a concentrated dose of toxicity wrapped in a soggy crust. But for a dock worker who hadn't eaten in 20 hours, the metallic tang of a Thames eel was the taste of another day of life.
However, the eels were the premium option. If you were truly down on your luck, you went for the saloop. This was a hot, greasy beverage made from powdered orchid roots or sassafras bark thickened with milk and sugar. It was marketed as a nutritional powerhouse, but by the mid-1800s, it was mostly used as a sobering agent for the thousands of Londoners who lived in a state of perpetual gin-soaked haze. It was cheap, it was warm, and it was often served in a communal mug that was never washed, merely wiped with a greasy rag between customers. But the most disturbing entry on the Victorian menu was the slink. In the meat markets of Smithfield, slink referred to the meat of animals that had died of disease or were stillborn. Legally, this shouldn't have been sold. In practice, it was the backbone of the street food industry. This tainted meat was chopped, heavily salted, and buried under a mountain of pepper and questionable spices to hide the scent of rot.
It was then sold as savory pies or hot sausages. When a Victorian laborer bit into a penny sausage, they weren't tasting pork, they were tasting a chemical cocktail designed to mask the flavor of a dying cow. This brings us to the great food adulteration scandal. Because there were no FDA-style regulations, food was whatever the seller said it was. To make bread appear whiter, bakers added alum and chalk. To give used tea leaves a second life, they were dried and dyed with Prussian blue, a toxic pigment. Even the sugar was often mixed with ground-up floor sweepings. It's estimated that by 1850, nearly 50% of the food sold on London streets contained some form of non-food filler, much of it poisonous. Bone bread, the industrial poisoning of the breakfast table. If you managed to find a roof, your breakfast was still a potential death warrant. In 1850, the most lethal weapon aimed at your life wasn't a revolver, it was the fluffy white loaf of bread on your table.
For the London elite, white bread was a status symbol. For the baker, it was an opportunity for fraud. Wheat was expensive, so to satisfy the demand for pure white bread, bakers turned to alum, a metallic salt used in leather tanning. Alum bleached the dough to a snowy white and allowed it to hold more water, making the loaf heavier and more profitable. But alum was just the beginning. To give the bread bulk, some bakers turned to ground-up bones. While bone bread sounds like a horror story, it was a well-founded suspicion for the poor. Bones were cheap, white when powdered, and added weight. In a city where nothing went to waste, the source of these bones was often questionable, scavenged from butcher scraps, or even harvested from shallow, overflowing graveyards. You were literally consuming the dead to survive the present. The fraud didn't stop at the crust. Bakers mixed flour with chalk, plaster of Paris, and pipe clay. Imagine biting into a sandwich that is 20% construction material. This wasn't a hidden conspiracy. It was an open secret reported by journals like The Lancet. The air inside these bakeries, usually located in damp, unventilated basements, was just as toxic. Rats scurried over the dough, and bakers suffering from respiratory diseases sweated into the mix. This wasn't artisanal. It was a subterranean factory of disease. The psychological impact of this food terror was a constant background noise. People knew the bread was doctored, but they had lost the ability to recognize real food. When pure bread was finally mandated, many complained it tasted strange. Their palates had been colonized by toxins. The Victorian Empire was built on the backs of people being slowly hollowed out by their own staples. Post-mortem photography, the theater of the living dead.
In the flickering gaslight of a London parlor, a family gathers for a portrait. A young daughter rests in her mother's lap, her eyes closed in a deep sleep. But she isn't sleeping. She has been dead for 2 days. Post-mortem photography is one of the most misunderstood rituals of the 19th century. In a city where child mortality was staggeringly high due to the bone bread and poor sanitation, death was a constant, intimate guest. For many families, a photograph was a rare luxury they couldn't afford while alive. When a child died suddenly of cholera, the parents realized with horror that they had no visual record of the face they loved. The photographer was called to capture a soul before it vanished. They used ingenious and macabre techniques, propping eyelids open, painting pupils directly onto the closed eyes, or adding a rosy tint to the cheeks to mimic the flush of life.
The standing portrait is where the true discomfort lies. Using heavy iron stands hidden behind curtains, photographers would literally bolt the body into a standing position. In these photos, the living often look more dead than the deceased because exposure times were so long, the living blurred as they breathed, while the dead remained perfectly, terrifyingly still. Note, these photos weren't hidden. They were sent as memorial cards to relatives. It was a shared social currency of grief that helped a society process the overwhelming volume of death. As the 20th century approached, death became medicalized and moved to funeral parlors. We began to fear the dead, and these portraits were tucked away as creepy artifacts. But for a mother who had lost 4 children in one winter, that photo was a shield against the miasma that tried to turn her children into forgotten statistics.
The Victorians didn't take these pictures because they loved death. They took them because they loved life so much they couldn't stand to see it end without a trace. Every line in these portraits, every chemical in that bread, and every eel pulled from the sewer tells the same story. Victorian London was a city that never stopped chewing on its own children. The Golden Age was white powdered with alum and chalk, but beneath that surface lay a reality so dark, it's a miracle anyone survived to tell the tale.